November 2nd, 1917. Kings Park Psychiatric Asylum on Long Island. In the ward for violent patients lingers the smell of bleach and human decomposition. On a filthy cot, strapped down with belts, a man is dying, one from whom even God has turned away. He is only 51 years old, but he looks 80. His skin is grey, parchment-coloured, and his brain has turned into a liquid substance several years ago. Doctors diagnose progressive paralysis. In the language of medical protocols of that time, this is a euphemism for the final stage of myelosyphilis. The man is delirious. He screams that he is a great writer. He demands champagne. He calls for servants who are not here. The orderlies changing his linens do not know who he is. To them, he is just another nameless lunatic by number who will free up the bed by morning. But if we could rewind the tape of time, we would see a completely different picture. This dying old man in the institutional pajamas is Roland Burnham Molyneux, Prince of New York, heir to one of America's largest industrial empires, a man whose cufflinks cost more than the annual salary of the orderly who is now wiping his mouth. Roland was the embodiment of what we today call gilded youth. Athlete, handsome man, chemist, social lion to whom any door in Manhattan was open. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but decided to replace it with a vial of cyanide. Before you lies not just a madman. Before you is the man who committed the most elegant and cynical murder of the Gilded Age. A murder not in a dark alley with a knife, but by mail, using an exquisite gift from Tiffany's jewelry house. The sum spent by his father on attempts to save this man from the electric chair, converted to modern money, amounts to more than $5.5 million. $5.5 million thrown away on lawyers, bribing witnesses, and endless appeals. And all this so that in the end he died here, in solitude, in the insane asylum, eaten away from the inside by his own disease and madness. This is not just a story of downfall. This is a story about how money can buy freedom, but cannot buy salvation. Why should you listen to this story today, in the year 2025? Because the ghost of Roland Molyneux still haunts every courtroom in the United States of America. Every time you turn on the news and hear about a high-profile trial of yet another star, be it Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, or any other influential figure, you are encountering Roland's legacy. Lawyers call it the Molyneux Rule. It is the cornerstone of American justice, born precisely in the case we are about to discuss. The essence of this rule is simple and monstrous at the same time. It prohibits the prosecutor from using the defendant's past crimes to prove his guilt in the current case. If a person stole an apple yesterday, that doesn't mean he stole a pear today. This rule was created to protect Roland, so that the jury wouldn't learn that before sending the deadly package to his enemy, he had already practiced on other people. Imagine the irony. New York's most notorious poisoner gifted the modern judicial system its main protective mechanism. 21st century maniacs and rapists walk free or receive lenient sentences thanks to the precedent created to save the life of a spoiled heir to the paint and varnish empire in the year 1900. We look at this story through the prism of 1.5 centuries, and it seems to us like a script for a thriller. But all of it was reality. Real checks written for astronomical sums. Real mercury cyanide bought at the pharmacy around the corner. A real silver bottle holder that became an instrument of death. We are used to thinking that the Gilded Age was balls, corsets, and formal dinners at Mrs. Astor's. That is a lie. Or at least only the facade. Behind the velvet curtains lurked rot. Behind the impeccable manners, hid sociopaths confident in their impunity. Roland Molyneux was the perfect product of his time. He believed that the world belonged to him by right of birth, and when the world refused to obey his whims, he decided to poison that world. Literally. Roland's story is not just a detective tale, it is an anatomy of decay. We will see how his father, General Edward Molyneux, a Civil War hero and man of honor, built his fortune, never imagining what a monster he had raised. We will walk through the luxurious halls of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, where gentlemen discussed sports and politics, while poison was slipped into their glasses. We will see how love for a woman can turn into deadly obsession. And most importantly, we will see the price that a family pays when it tries to buy its son back from the devil. But before we dive into this abyss, remember one detail. When the orderlies carried Roland's body out of the ward, they found nothing of value in his personal belongings. No gold watches, no diamond rings that he so loved to wear in his youth. Only a stack of scribbled paper with mad ravings. The man who had everything departed into nothingness, leaving us only a legal paragraph in law textbooks and a story that chills the blood. Welcome to New York at the end of the 19th century. Welcome to a world where death arrives by mail in beautiful packaging. To understand the nature of the poison, one must first study the vessel in which it was contained. To understand Roland Molyneux, we must look at the man whose shadow covered him from birth, his father. General Edward Leslie Molyneux was a man of steel and gunpowder. If his son became the symbol of the era's degeneration, the father was its backbone. He was the classic archetype of the founder, a man who did not inherit an empire, but tore it from reality with his own teeth and bayonet. Edward Molyneux made his name not at balls, but in the mud and blood of the Civil War. He commanded a brigade in the Union Army. In the Battle of Pleasant Hill, when the lines wavered and soldiers were ready to flee, Colonel Molyneux, bleeding from a facial wound, personally led the men in a counterattack. The bullet shattered his jaw, but he did not leave the battlefield until victory was secured. Remember this detail. Jaw shattered by enemy lead. This is important for understanding the family psychology. The father knew the price of pain. The father knew what it was to look death in the eyes. For him, life was a battlefield where the strongest, disciplined, and brave prevail. He survived where thousands perished and returned home a hero with an impeccable reputation. After the war, the general transferred his military grip to another front, industrial. America was rising from the ashes. Cities were being rebuilt. The country needed color to cover the gray scars of war, and Molyneux gave it that color. He became a partner, and then the driving force of the company. C.T. Reynolds & Co., the largest paint manufacturer in the United States. Imagine New York in the 1870s. This is not sterile offices. This is smoking chimneys, vats with boiling chemicals, the smell of turpentine and lead permeating the clothes. Molyneux's empire was built on chemistry, on mixing dangerous ingredients to create something durable and bright. The general was a genius of logistics and management. His factories ran like clockwork. His accounting books were impeccable. Every morning he rose before dawn. No alcohol before lunch, strict discipline, absolute honesty in deals. He was a Puritan in the temple of capitalism. By the time of Roland's birth, the general's fortune was valued at figures that an ordinary person of that time could scarcely comprehend. Converted to modern rates, it amounted to tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. But General Molyneux did not build golden palaces for vanity as the Vanderbilts did. He lived in a rich but strict house in Brooklyn. For him, wealth was a tool, a resource to be guarded and multiplied, not squandered to the winds. He believed in meritocracy, the rule of the worthy. He believed that his children would inherit not only his checkbook, but also his moral code. And here lies the tragic mistake of the founder. General Molyneux committed the same crime against logic as hundreds of other magnates of that era. He wanted to give his children everything that he himself had been deprived of. He wanted to spare them the horrors of war, hunger, the necessity of fighting their way with fists. He created a greenhouse world for Roland, devoid of resistance. Roland grew up seeing his father as an unattainable ideal, war hero, tycoon, respected citizen. But Roland himself did not want to fight. He liked another side of his father's business, chemistry. The general encouraged this passion. He saw continuity in it. The boy is interested in paint composition. The boy spends hours in the laboratory. The father thought he was raising a future industrialist who would modernize production and lead the company into the 20th century. He hired the best tutors, bought the most expensive equipment for his son's home experiments. No one could have guessed that young Roland viewed chemistry not as a way to create industrial paints, but as the art of power over life and death. In the laboratory built with his father's money, among flasks and retorts bought from the proceeds of honest business, Roland learned not to create. He learned to destroy. Those very chemical elements that made the Molyneux name a synonym for quality and reliability, mercury, lead, arsenic, in the Heir's hands turned into weapons. General Molyneux built a fortress to protect his family from the outside world. But he forgot to check the foundation. He did not notice that the enemy was inside the perimeter. He raised his son in the conviction that he was special, that the Molyneux name opens any door. Roland absorbed this lesson, but distorted it beyond recognition. If the father believed that high position obliges one to be noble, then the son decided that high position gives the right to be above the law. The gap between generations was colossal. Father, a Victorian gentleman with a shattered jaw and iron principles; son, a pampered narcissist of the Gilded Age whose hands never knew calluses, but who considered himself entitled to decide people's fates. The general built for centuries. Roland lived day by day. The irony of fate lay in the fact that it was precisely the father's impeccable reputation and vast fortune that would become the fuel allowing Roland's bonfire of madness to burn so long and so brightly. The general created a machine he could not control. And when that machine began to kill, the old soldier had to enter his last, most terrifying battle. A battle not for the country, but for the soul of his damned son. By the end of the 19th century, New York had finally shed its provincial modesty and dressed itself in damask, velvet, and diamonds. This was the era that Mark Twain aptly and poisonously dubbed the Gilded Age. Not golden, note the difference, but precisely gilded. The thinnest layer of gold leaf over cheap cast iron, concealing cracks, rust, and moral decay. And if General Molyneux was that very cast iron foundation, then his son, Roland, became that dazzling but deceptive golden sheen. The time of the first generation of heirs arrived. People who never knew what hunger, cold, or the fear of insolvency is. For the general, $1 was the equivalent of shed sweat or blood. For Roland, $1 was simply an abstract unit of measuring pleasure, an infinite resource flowing from the faucet of his father's empire. Roland Molyneux grew up in a world where self-restraint was considered a sign of poverty, and modesty a lack of imagination. By 30, Roland had transformed into the ideal avatar of his era. He was handsome in that somewhat cloying beauty that was fashionable in the 1890s. Pomaded hair, perfectly curled mustache, moist gaze, and impeccable posture. He considered himself a Renaissance man thrown into industrial New York. Chemist by profession, athlete by vocation, social lion by lifestyle. He worked at his father's factory, Morris Herman and Company, a subsidiary of the Molyneux Empire engaged in the production of dry paints. But let's be honest, this was not work in the modern sense. This was an expensive game of science. While workers in the workshops breathed lead dust for pennies, Roland, in his personal office furnished with mahogany, experimented with colors. He was obsessed with the saturation of shades. He was fascinated by Prussian blue and vermilion. But even more, he was fascinated by chemistry's power over matter. There was a dark irony in this. He created pigments to make the world brighter, but used the same knowledge to prepare mixtures capable of extinguishing life in seconds. His access to poisons was unlimited. Cyanides, arsenic, strychnine. For a chemist of his level and status, these were as commonplace as salt and pepper on the dining table. But the main stage for the spectacle called The Life of Roland Molyneux was not the factory, but the club. Specifically, the Knickerbocker Athletic Club. This place deserves a separate description because it is precisely here that the tragedy will unfold. Imagine a modern elite fitness club crossed with a five-star hotel and the British Parliament. The building at the corner of Madison Avenue and 45th Street was a temple of hedonism. Marble pools with heating, fencing halls, oak-paneled libraries, cigar rooms where the air was thick with smoke from Cuban cigars costing a worker's daily wage. Membership in such a club cost insane amounts of money. But money was merely the entry ticket. The main currency here was status. And Roland craved that status, like a junkie craves a dose. He did not just want to be a club member, he wanted to be its king. He spent thousands of dollars treating the right people. He ordered suits from the best London tailors to strut through the club lobby and catch envious glances on himself. His wardrobe was his armor. Silk vests, perfectly tailored frock coats, gemstone cufflinks. Every detail screamed that you were in the presence of the elect. Converted to modern money, Roland's lifestyle cost the family approximately $300,000 to $400,000 a year. And this was only for pocket money. He lived in a constant arms race in the realm of luxury. If a rival acquired a new cane with a gold knob, Roland, the next day, bought a cane with an ivory knob, inlaid with rubies. This was a pathological need to dominate. He was a textbook narcissist. Any inattention to his person he perceived as an insult, any criticism as a declaration of war. But behind this brilliant facade lurked rot. The gilding began to crack. Roland was a deeply unhappy, insecure person who panicked at the thought of being second. In the depths of his soul brewed a dark, sticky envy toward everyone who dared to be more successful, more athletic, or more popular than him. He behaved like a spoiled prince, convinced that the laws of physics and morality did not apply to him. It was precisely in the Knickerbocker Athletic Club that this toxic cocktail formed. The boredom of a rich heir, access to dangerous chemicals, and a wounded ego. The club was a microcosm of New York. It had its own factions, its own intrigues, and its own enemies. Roland, who considered himself the best athlete, he did indeed perform well on the parallel bars and rings, encountered reality there. He was good, but not perfect, and there were people who dared to contradict him. One such person was Harry Cornish, the club's athletic director. A hired man, not an equal to the aristocrat Molyneux, but one who wielded real power within the building's walls. Cornish did not fawn over the rich heir. He demanded adherence to the rules. He could issue a reprimand. For Roland, this was unthinkable. How dare a servant instruct his master? In Roland's brain, poisoned by mercury fumes and his own pride, a plan began to take shape. Not just to fire the insolent one. That would be too simple. Roland wanted to prove his absolute superiority. Thus, amid crystal chandeliers, velvet sofas, and the scent of expensive cognac, in the heart of the Gilded Age, the idea of murder began to form. Not for money, there was plenty of that. Not for self-defense, but for wounded vanity. It was a whim elevated to the absolute. Roland Molyneux, standing by the club window and gazing at Madison Avenue, felt like a god who decides who lives and who dies. He did not yet know that by setting this mechanism in motion, he would destroy not only his enemies, but also everything his father had built. The gold's shine was dazzling, but beneath it, the stench of corpse poison was already seeping through. In New York, at the end of the 19th century, social status was not just a pleasant addition to a bank account. It was armor, without which a person, even one possessing millions, felt naked. And the war that Roland Molyneux waged within the walls of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club was a classic illustration of the conflict between a wounded ego and reality. It was a battle not for territory, but for the right to be the sole alpha male in the pack. Roland's enemy, Harry Cornish, was the ideal antithesis to our hero. If Molyneux was a pampered product of inherited wealth, then Cornish was a self-made man. The club's athletic director, sturdy, pragmatic, respected by the board of directors for his efficiency. For Roland, Cornish's very existence was an insult. How could a hired employee, essentially a head servant, dictate terms to a club member? How could a man without pedigree reprimand General Molyneux's son about how to use gymnastic equipment or behave in the locker room? The conflict began with trifles, as often happens in closed male communities. A sideways glance at the billiard table, an ill-timed joke, a dispute over rules of conduct. But in Roland's inflamed brain, it turned into a crusade. He began bombarding the board of directors with complaints. He demanded Cornish's dismissal, using the most ornate and poisonous formulations. He spent hours composing letters on expensive paper with monograms, in which he accused the director of incompetence, rudeness, and lack of manners. But then the unthinkable happened. The club's board of directors, other rich and influential gentlemen, sided with Cornish. They politely but firmly asked Roland to moderate his zeal. For Molyneux, this was a public slap in the face. He, a representative of the elite, was rejected in favor of service staff. In his coordinate system, where name and money decide everything, a glitch occurred. The society he so aspired to belong to and rule over put him in his place. This was an humiliation that a narcissist like Roland could not forgive. He realized, to win this war, ordinary social tools, intrigues, and complaints were no longer enough. However, on the horizon appeared a figure who turned this social war into a true Shakespearean tragedy. A woman. Blanche Cheeseborough. If Roland was the embodiment of male vanity in the Gilded Age, then Blanche was the icon of female social climbing. A singer who possessed not so much an outstanding voice as an outstanding ability to charm men. She was beautiful, with a predatory, sensual beauty. Blanche did not belong to high society by right of birth, but she firmly decided to get there, using men as stepping stones. She sought not love, she sought a sponsor, status, and security. In this love triangle, the third corner was Henry Barnett, another club member, a broker, a man pleasant in every way, the life of the party. And, most terrifying for Roland, Barnett was also courting Blanche. And he was succeeding better. Barnett was light, witty, and did not suffer from the heavy, suffocating seriousness that was characteristic of Molyneux. Imagine this picture: the luxurious restaurant Delmonico's, where dinner costs as much as a worker's apartment rent for a month. Crystal, silver, ladies in ostrich feathers. At one table sits Henry Barnett with Blanche. They laugh, drink champagne. They are the center of attention. And somewhere in the shadows, gripping the stem of his glass so tightly that his knuckles turn white, Roland watches them. He sees not just flirtation, he sees them stealing his trophy from him. In his understanding, Blanche is a prize that should go to the best, and the best can only be him. Henry Barnett made a fatal mistake. He was not just competing with Roland for a woman. He was a friend of Harry Cornish, the very hated club director. In Molyneux's sick mind, these two merged into a single, multi-headed dragon standing in the way of his happiness and greatness. Barnett humiliated him on the romantic front. Cornish humiliated him in the club. It was a conspiracy. The whole world was against him. The social war entered the phase of guerrilla actions. Roland, using his skills and money, tried to blacken his rivals. But gossip didn't work. Barnett continued to be popular, Cornish continued to run the club, and Blanche continued to accept attentions from both, weighing whose checkbook was thicker. She was cynical to the bone. For her, ultimately, it didn't matter who won, as long as the winner could pay her dressmaker's bills. It was at this moment that Roland Molyneux crossed the line. He realized that the social elevator on which he wanted to rise to the top had stalled. Society rejected his attempts to dominate, and then he decided to build his own elevator, an elevator that runs on chemistry. He returned to his laboratory at his father's factory. There, amid the smell of solvents, he felt confident. There, no one could laugh at him. He began studying the properties of mercury cyanide and diphtheria bacilli. This was his secret argument in the dispute. If he cannot oust Cornish from the club by the board of directors' vote, he will oust him into the grave. If he cannot outcharm Barnett, he will simply remove him from the playing field. This was the peak of the era's cynicism. Roland had no intention of dueling by shooting, as gentlemen of the past did. A duel is a risk. In a duel, you can be killed too. Roland wanted a safe victory. He wanted to kill remotely, with others' hands, remaining in white gloves. He perceived it as a business transaction, elimination of competitors. Only instead of mergers and acquisitions, the tool was poison. By the end of autumn in 1898, the social war reached its boiling point. Blanche was leaning more and more toward Barnett. Cornish felt more secure in the director's chair. Roland was cornered by his own vanity. And he made his move. Not a loud scandal, not a fight in the club lobby. A quiet, inconspicuous move. A package by mail. A small box with medicine. No one in New York yet suspected that the rules of the game had changed forever. That death had arrived in elite mansions and closed clubs, disguised as care. Roland Molyneux, gentleman, athlete, and heir, declared war not just on two people. He declared war on life itself, deciding that he had the right to edit the list of the living as easily as crossing names off a party guest list. In the world of big capital, it is customary to say that money loves silence. But in the story of Roland Molyneux, money fell in love with death. The fifth part of our drama is the culmination of cynicism, the moment when human relationships finally turned into a stock ticker. If you thought that the deal of the century in the Gilded Age was the Vanderbilts exchanging millions for a British duke's title, you are mistaken. The most terrible deal was made not in London, but in New York, between a murderer and a woman who preferred not to ask too many questions. The first act of this deal began with a package, but not the one that killed Mrs. Adams, we will talk about her later, but a trial run. The victim was Henry Barnett, the very merry broker who had the misfortune of being Blanche Cheeseborough's favorite. At the end of October 1898, Barnett received a neat box by mail. Inside was a package of Kutnow's powder, a popular effervescent remedy for improving digestion at the time. This was perfectly normal. Manufacturers often sent free samples to wealthy club members. Barnett, who loved to eat and drink well, was delighted with the gift. He took the medicine. The effect was instantaneous, but far from healing. Barnett felt as if his insides were engulfed in flames. His throat constricted, his breathing became hoarse. The doctors summoned to the patient's bedside were baffled. The symptoms resembled diphtheria, a terrible disease of the time that strangled its victims. No one could suspect poisoning. Who would think of poisoning an innocent broker with the most complex chemical compound? Mercury cyanide. On November 10th, 1898, Henry Barnett died in agony. On the death certificate, they wrote, diphtheria. Roland Molyneux, upon learning this news, probably didn't even smile. He simply checked off an item on his mental to-do list. Obstacle eliminated. Path clear. And here begins what makes the blood run cold in the veins. Normal mourning in the Victorian era lasted at least a year. Propriety demanded a pause, respect for the memory of the deceased, especially if he was a close friend or lover. But Roland Molyneux lived by a different calendar, the calendar of a predator who fears the prey will grow cold. He proposed to Blanche Cheeseborough practically over the cooling body of his rival. And Blanche? This femme fatale, a singer without a voice but with huge ambitions, agreed. On the 29th of November, 1898, remember this date, only 19 days had passed since Henry Barnett's death. 19 days. The earth on Barnett's grave was still fresh. The flowers on the wreaths had barely wilted, and in the church, wedding bells were already ringing. Roland Molyneux and Blanche Cheeseborough became husband and wife. This was a wedding steeped not in love, but in macabre calculation. For Blanche, it was a way out of financial uncertainty. Barnett was sweet, but dead. Molyneux was strange, frightening, but alive and fabulously wealthy. Like an experienced trader, she closed a losing position and invested in a new asset. She sold her grief for the Molyneux name and access to his father's accounts. For Roland, this was a victory in the war for status. He didn't just get married. He took the woman from a dead enemy, like a barbarian taking a trophy from the battlefield. This was the ultimate manifestation of narcissism. He proved to himself that he could rewrite reality, kill a rival, disguise it as illness, and immediately claim his beloved, and no one, not the police, not society, not even the bride herself, would say a word against it. Their honeymoon resembled a feast during the plague. They settled in a luxurious hotel, spent money at a mad pace, attended the opera. Roland showered Blanche with jewels, as if trying to drown out the whisper of conscience with the sparkle of diamonds, if he had one at all. But those around began to notice something amiss. The haste of the wedding caused talk. In New York's salons, they whispered, "Too soon, isn't it? Did she really not love poor Henry?" However, Roland did not stop. Success with Barnett's murder intoxicated him. He felt invincible. The mechanism had worked perfectly. Mail delivered the poison. The doctor issued a false diagnosis. Victim in the grave, prize in hand. If it worked once, why not repeat? After all, there was still one enemy left. Harry Cornish, the club director, who was still breathing, walking the earth, and defending Roland's greatness with his very existence. The deal of the century for Roland consisted in exchanging his soul for a sense of omnipotence. He believed himself to be the arbiter of fates. In his inflamed brain, a logical chain formed. I killed Barnett and got Blanche. I will kill Cornish and gain absolute respect in the club. In December, just a couple of weeks after the wedding, Roland began preparing the second package. This time, he decided to be even more sophisticated. He bought an exquisite silver bottle holder at Tiffany's store. It was an item of luxury, a symbol of good taste, and to this gift he attached a jar of bromo seltzer, a popular headache remedy. Inside, of course, was not bromo, but a lethal dose of mercury cyanide. The cynicism of this preparation defies comprehension. A newlywed, just back from his honeymoon, sits in his laboratory or office, carefully packaging poison in festive paper, writing his enemy's address in disguised handwriting, while in the next room, his young wife tries on new outfits bought with money saved from her former lover's funeral. This was a world where a human life was worth less than an ounce of silver from Tiffany, where marriage was a deal merging capitals and ambitions, sealed with the blood of the third wheel. Roland Molyneux, in those days, reached the peak of his power and his madness. He was convinced he held God by the beard, but he forgot one detail. Poison is a weapon that has a habit of returning to the sender, and the second package, intended for Cornish, would find a completely different victim, setting off a chain of events that would destroy this perfect life to the foundations. The union of Roland and Blanche, born on a grave and sealed with cyanide, was doomed. But for now, they whirled in a waltz, shining in the light of gas lamps, while under the Christmas tree, so to speak, a deadly gift for the next enemy was already placed. New York was preparing for Christmas of 1898, unaware that Santa Claus, in the person of Gentleman Molyneux, brings not joy, but agonizing death. To understand how a person comes to the thought of sending death in gift wrapping, one must look where he slept, ate, and thought. We enter the Molyneux house, but not as guests, but as invisible observers, forensic experts examining the crime scene long before the first drop of blood is shed. Homes of Gilded Age tycoons were not created for comfort. They were built as sets for displaying power, as huge safes for storing antiquities and human ambitions. The Molyneux family mansion, like the homes of their circle, suffered from what design historians would later call the Victorian fear of empty space. Every horizontal surface was cluttered with statuettes, vases, clocks, and candelabras. Walls paneled in dark oak and mahogany absorbed the light, creating perpetual twilight even on a sunny day. Heavy velvet drapes on the windows blocked street noise and fresh air, preserving inside the smell of beeswax, cigar smoke, and old money. In this space, a person felt small and insignificant. The architecture oppressed. High ceilings with stucco loomed over the inhabitants, reminding them that they were obliged to match the grandeur of the family name. For General Molyneux, This house was a trophy, proof of his success. For Roland, it became a golden cage and, ultimately, a laboratory of madness. Let us walk through the corridors. Do you hear? Silence. But this is not the peaceful silence of repose, but tense silence, like in a museum or a crypt. This silence is broken only by the rustle of maids' skirts and the creak of starched collars of footmen. Servants in such houses were a separate caste. They were the living surveillance cameras of that era. They saw everything, but were obliged to be invisible. The maids knew that the sheets on Roland and Blanche's marital bed remained cold on both sides. The butler knew how much brandy the young heir drank when he locked himself in his study. The footman saw with what maniacal meticulousness Roland sorted the mail. Later, at the trial, it would be these invisible people who gave testimony that shattered the gentleman's alibis. They would tell of strange smells emanating from Roland's rooms, his sudden bursts of anger, how he spent hours practicing forging handwriting. The house's architecture, meant to protect the owner's secrets, actually accumulated evidence against them. But the heart of darkness in this house was neither the bedroom nor the drawing room. It was Roland's personal space, his study laboratory. Here clashed two worlds, the world of high aesthetics and the world of deadly chemistry. On a polished walnut table costing the annual income of an average American family, elegant quill pens with gold nibs neighbored crude apothecary scales. Look at this table more closely. Here lies that very item which will become a legendary piece of evidence. The silver bottle holder from Tiffany. An exquisite item covered in delicate filigree. Roland bought it not for beauty. He bought it as a Trojan horse. Imagine him sitting here under the gas lamplight. His hands, well groomed with impeccable manicure, touch the cold metal. He admires the item. He is an aesthete. For him, murder must be beautiful. He does not want to simply poison an enemy with rat poison in a back alley. No, death must come in the shine of silver, with the stamp of America's finest jewelry house. Next to the silver stands a jar of bromo seltzer, a blue glass bottle familiar to every American of that time as a remedy for hangovers and headaches. Roland carefully opens it. He pours out the harmless powder and begins the substitution process. His movements are precise, like those of a surgeon or jeweler. He mixes mercury cyanide with the remnants of the medicine. Mercury cyanide is not just poison. It is agony packaged in molecules. It corrodes the insides, causes paralysis and suffocation. Roland knows this. He is a chemist. He imagines what Cornish will feel when he drinks this mixture, and it gives him pleasure. Roland's loneliness at this moment is absolute. He is alone in the universe. The wife whom he bought at the price of murdering her previous lover is somewhere in another part of the house or city, occupied with her outfits. The father, the general, is busy saving the business's reputation. Roland has no friends, only flatterers and enemies. In this study, he is alone with his demon. He takes a sheet of brown packing paper, manila paper. This is also an important detail. Such paper was sold everywhere. It was anonymous. He wraps the gift, the silver holder inside which the deadly bottle is hidden. Then he takes sealing wax, red like arterial blood. He melts it over a candle flame. The smell of hot wax mixes with the smell of almonds. Some cyanides smell like that, although mercury cyanide has more of a metallic tang. He applies the seal. Now the most difficult part, the address. Roland knows that his handwriting is known. He needs to write the address so that no one recognizes the aristocrat's hand. He tries to write angularly, crudely, imitating the handwriting of an uneducated person or a clerk. Mr. Harry Cornish, Knickerbocker Athletic Club. Each letter is a lie. Each flourish is an attempt to deceive fate. The ready package lies on the table. In it, death. But not just Cornish's death. In this box lies the end of the Gilded Age for the Molyneux family. In it lies the collapse of the father's reputation, Roland's own madness, and the death of an innocent woman who had done nothing wrong. The house is silent. The clocks in the hall solemnly chime the time. The pendulum swings. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Life, death, life, death. Roland stands up, takes the package, and steps out into the cold December evening. He heads to the post office. He feels like an architect of reality who, with one stroke of the pen and one package, can rebuild the world to suit himself. But he is not an architect. He is merely a spoiled child playing with matches in a gunpowder warehouse. And the spark has already been struck. When Roland drops the package into the mailbox, he sets in motion a mechanism that will destroy the walls of this house, tear down the velvet drapes, and expose all the rot of their lives to public view. The architecture of power crumbles when the foundation is mixed with blood. And very soon, knocking at the mansion's door will not be guests in tuxedos, but detectives with an arrest warrant. But for now, silence. The package begins its journey through snowy New York toward a Christmas that will be bloody. Christmas Eve, 1898. New York is blanketed in snow. Store windows glow with lights, and the air smells of roasted chestnuts and pine. To the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, this bastion of male smugness, the postman delivers a parcel. Addressee, Mr. Harry Cornish. The club director takes the package in his hands. It is not heavy, wrapped in plain manila paper, but something solid can be felt inside. Cornish, a practical man not prone to sentimentality, is nevertheless intrigued. Who sent the gift? Inside, he finds that very silver bottle holder from Tiffany, an exquisite item, and a blue bottle of bromo seltzer. No note, just a blank postcard. Cornish, like any normal person of that time, takes this as an anonymous gesture of goodwill, perhaps a secret admirer, or a club member deciding to smooth over some old conflict. The evil irony of fate. Cornish thinks this is a Christmas gift. In reality, it is a time bomb ticking in his pocket. He carries death home. He shows it to colleagues. He jokes about it. "Look, some nut sent me hangover medicine and silver," he laughs. If he had known that this laughter would cost the life of the person he loved, he would have torn out his own tongue. December 28th, morning, apartment on West 86th Street. Here live Cornish's aunt, Mrs. Catherine Adams, and her daughter. Miss Adams is a typical matron of that time, a kind woman of 49, far from the intrigues of social lions and chemical experiments. That morning she complains of a headache. Migraine torments her. Harry Cornish, the caring nephew, remembers the gift. "I have something that will help you, Aunt," he says. He takes out that very blue bottle from the silver holder. He pours the powder into a glass of water. He hands her the glass. At this moment, the rot hidden behind the golden facade of the Molyneux life breaks through to the surface. This is a scene of biblical scale. An innocent victim accepts the cup of poison from the hands of a relative who meant well. Mrs. Adams takes a sip. "What a strange taste," she says, grimacing. "Bitter." She takes another sip, and the glass falls from her hands, shattering on the parquet. Death from mercury cyanide is not like a peaceful sleep, as described in bad novels. It is a cruel, physiological catastrophe. In mere seconds, Miss Adams's face darkens. Her body arches in a bow. Muscles convulse with such force that it seems the bones will snap. Cornish, in horror, tries to help her. He himself tastes the liquid from the bottle to understand what happened, a fatal mistake that nearly killed him too. But he only sipped, and it made him vomit. Mrs. Adams drank a dose sufficient to kill a regiment of soldiers. 30 minutes later, she was gone. At this moment, when screams of horror and pain filled the apartment on 86th Street, Roland Molyneux was probably breakfasting in his mansion, spreading jam on toast. He did not yet know that he had missed the mark. He aimed at his enemy but hit a random, innocent woman. But for the law, it made no difference. For the law, this became the beginning of the end. And here begins the true Gilded Age, the age of yellow journalism. The tragedy of the Adams family became fuel for the blaze ignited by newspaper magnates Pulitzer and Hearst. As soon as the police confirmed that the bottle contained cyanide and the package trail led to enemies of Cornish, the name Molyneux floated to the surface like a bloated corpse. Journalists descended on this story like a school of piranhas. Millionaire heir, a poisoner? Death in Tiffany silver. The newspapers began digging, and the rot flowed like a river. Suddenly, they remembered the death of Henry Barnett just a month earlier. "Wait," wrote the reporters, "isn't this the same Barnett from whom Molyneux stole the bride? And didn't he die from a strange diphtheria, whose symptoms suspiciously resemble mercury poisoning?" Barnett's body was exhumed. This was an unheard-of desecration for high society. Gravediggers in tuxedos. And what did they find? Mercury cyanide. In Barnett's organs, they found the same poison that killed Mrs. Adams. The facade of Roland's perfect life collapsed in an instant. This was no longer a story of an accident. This was a story of a serial killer in a silk top hat. The society that yesterday fawned over the Molyneux family's wealth, today watched their fall with relish. And what about Roland himself? He behaved as he was accustomed, arrogantly. He did not flee, he did not repent. He threatened to sue the newspapers for libel. He believed that his father's money was a magic shield. But the rot had already penetrated inside his own home. Blanche, his wife, the femme fatale, suddenly realized whom she shared her bed with. Imagine her horror. She had married a man who, it turned out, killed her previous lover to get her. She was not a trophy. She was evidence. Every glance from Roland now seemed a threat to her. Every cup of tea he offered her caused a shiver. Is there no almond aftertaste? The marriage, entered into 19 days ago, turned into a horror film. The police began working with unprecedented speed. Handwriting experts, the new fashionable science of the time, compared the address on the package with Roland's letters. The matches were obvious. Workers at his father's factory gave testimony. Yes, young Mr. Roland was interested in cyanides. Yes, he ordered those substances. General Molyneux, the old soldier, was in shock. His world of honor and dignity was destroyed. But he did what any father would do. He threw all his resources into defending his son. He hired the best lawyers in New York. He turned his home into a defense headquarters. But there was nothing to defend. The fortress had fallen from within. By the end of January 1899, Roland Molyneux was arrested. When they led him out of the mansion, the crowd on the street whistled and jeered. That very populace he had looked down on now thirsted for his blood. Gentleman Poisoner, this nickname stuck to him forever. In the cell of the Tombs prison, a grim Gothic building where the most dangerous criminals were held, Roland, for the first time, confronted reality without gilding. There were no footmen here. It smelled not of perfume, but of fear and excrement. Here, his surname meant nothing, except that the other prisoners wanted to see the rich boy who kills by mail. The rot had eaten through everything. The family's reputation, the life of an innocent woman, love, if it ever existed, and Roland's own sanity. Sitting in his cell, he still believed it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a servant's conspiracy. He did not understand that the poison he sent into the world had returned to poison his own life. The deal with the devil was closed, and the devil came to collect the debt. The trial of the century was beginning. If you think that modern trials of stars like Johnny Depp or O.J. Simpson are a circus, then you simply haven't seen New York in 1899. The trial of Roland Molyneux became the first reality show in history where the stakes were life, and the audience stretched across the entire country. It was a point of no return not only for one family, but for the entire American judicial system. November 14th, 1899. The Criminal Courts Building on Center Street. The crowd began gathering as early as 5 in the morning. People fought for seats. Tickets to the courtroom were sold on the black market for fabulous sums, $10 to $20, equivalent to $300 to $600 today. Ladies from high society in feathered hats sat next to pickpockets and street vendors chewing tobacco. Everyone wanted to see one thing: how the prince of the Gilded Age would writhe on the frying pan of justice. The trial lasted 3 months. It was the most expensive legal battle in the history of the state of New York at that time. The total cost of the trial for taxpayers was $200,000, about $7.5 million today. But the defendant's father spent even more. General Edward Molyneux, a man with an iron jaw and a broken heart, literally burned his fortune in the furnace of defense. He hired Bartow Weeks, one of the most expensive lawyers of the era, and an entire army of private detectives. Each day of the trial cost the general $1,000, $35,000 in modern money. Prosecutor James Osborne was a bulldog. He understood that he was judging not just a man, but a class. He turned the trial into a class war. He waved the very Tiffany silver bottle holder in front of the jury's noses, shouting, "Look at this! Only a man like Molyneux could turn art into a weapon of murder." He painted the portrait of an arrogant, spoiled sociopath who believes that laws are written for the plebeians. But the main hero of this trial was not a person, but science. It was the battle of experts. At that time, there was no DNA analysis yet, and fingerprints were just entering use, and courts did not trust them. The main evidence was handwriting. The prosecution called 14 handwriting experts. Armed with magnifying glasses and projectors, they spent hours dissecting the flourishes on the package, comparing them to Roland's love letters. "Look at the letter K in the word Knickerbocker," the prosecutor thundered. "This angle of slant, this pressure, this is the hand of the murderer." The defense, in response, brought in their own experts, who claimed the opposite. The jurors, simple shopkeepers and workers, went mad from the abundance of terms. But through all this noise, one truth emerged. Roland Molyneux was lying. His alibi crumbled. The servants testified against him. His attempts to forge the handwriting were too obvious. February 10th, 1900. Verdict Day. The courtroom was packed so tightly that people could barely breathe. Roland stood straight as a string. He was dressed impeccably, his face a mask of polite indifference. He still believed that his own could not convict one of their own. But the jurors were not his own. When the foreman of the jury pronounced the word guilty, a sigh swept through the room like a gust of wind. Judge Neuberger, looking into the eyes of the Empire's heir, read the sentence: "Death by electrocution." At that moment, Roland's mask cracked. Witnesses described how he went pale, becoming like a ghost. His hands trembled. General Molyneux, sitting in the front row, covered his face with his hands. The great paint empire he had built for 40 years collapsed. All his millions, all his connections, all his battle honors could not save his son from the word death. The point of no return was crossed physically when Roland was transferred to Sing Sing prison. This place was hell on earth. He was placed in the death house. Imagine this contrast. The man who yesterday slept on silk sheets and drank wine from crystal now found himself in a stone cell 3 by 6 feet. Roland's neighbors were not members of an elite club. These were real murderers, rapists, gangsters, people with faces scarred and souls black with sins. And among them, the gentleman poisoner in his expensive suit, which was now useless rags. The death row cell in Sing Sing was a place of psychological torture. It was located just a few meters from the room with the electric chair. The inmates heard everything. They heard the hum of the generator when it was tested. They smelled the ozone. They knew that when the light bulbs in their cells began to flicker, it meant that Old Sparky, as they called the chair, was taking another soul. Roland spent nearly 2 years in this cell. 2 years awaiting death. This time broke him. His arrogance turned to paranoia. He began to write, a lot, feverishly. He wrote memoirs, poems, philosophical treatises. He tried to convince himself and the world that he was not a criminal, but a martyr, a victim of circumstances. His writings from that period reeked of the onset of that very madness that would later consume him entirely. But the most terrible tragedy unfolded not in the cell, but on the outside. General Molyneux turned into a shadow of himself. He sold off assets. He mortgaged real estate. He groveled before politicians. He spent his last money on appeals. "I will save him, even if I have to end up in a single shirt," he said. Roland's mother took to her bed with a nervous breakdown. His wife, Blanche, filed for divorce. The rats were fleeing the sinking ship. Blanche realized that being the widow of a hanged man, or fried one, was a bad career move. She abandoned Roland in his darkest hour, confirming that their marriage was merely a deal. For Roland, sitting on death row, this became the final knife in the back. In the death row cell at Sing Sing, Roland Molyneux underwent a transformation. From Golden Boy, he became inmate number 138. He watched as his neighbors were led down the corridor, never to return. He heard final prayers and screams. He smelled burning flesh. It was here, on the edge of being and non-being, that the legend was born. Roland became a celebrity. Newspapers printed his prison diaries. Women sent him flowers and letters with confessions of love. The Bonnie and Clyde syndrome worked back then, too. America was divided. Some demanded that the rich man be fried as soon as possible. Others saw in him a romantic hero, a victim of judicial error. But the fact remained. The clock was ticking. The New York State Appellate Court was reviewing the case. The chances were negligible. Less than 1% of death sentences were overturned at that time. Roland prepared to die. He ordered his last meal. He wrote a farewell letter to his father. He gazed into the abyss, and the abyss began gazing back into him, altering the structure of his brain forever. What would emerge from this cell, if the appeal succeeded, would no longer be a man. It would be a broken doll with the eyes of an old man. On October 15th, 1901, a miracle occurred. Bought at a price exceeding the budget of some small states, the New York State Appellate Court accomplished the impossible. It overturned Roland Molyneux's death sentence. It was precisely on this day that the very Molyneux rule we mentioned at the beginning was born. The judges, sitting in their high chairs, ruled. The prosecutors had overreached. The death of Henry Barnett could not be used to prove the murder of Mrs. Adams unless a direct connection was proven 100%. This was the triumph of legal casuistry over common sense. The system, created to protect rights, worked perfectly for the one who had money for the best lawyer. Roland was transferred from death row back to the Tombs prison to await a second trial. Old Sparky remained hungry, but if Roland thought the nightmare was over, he was mistaken. The mathematics of the curse began. The second trial, held in the fall of 1902, was entirely different. General Molyneux, aged 20 years in these 3 years, scraped the last cents from the bottom of his coffers. There was no money left for the previous pomp. The defense changed tactics. Instead of aggression, they chose a strategy of doubt. "Where are the direct evidences?" the new lawyers asked. No one saw Roland sending the package. Handwriting? That's subjective opinion. Poison? Any chemist has access to poisons. On November 11th, 1902, the jury retired to deliberate. They needed only 15 minutes to deliver the verdict. Not guilty. Roland Molyneux walked out of the courthouse a free man. But it was the emptiest freedom in New York history. When he stepped onto the sidewalk, the crowd did not applaud. People were silent. They parted before him like before a leper. He won his life, but lost his place in the world of people. Returning home, Roland found ruins. The Brooklyn mansion, once a fortress full of life, now resembled a tomb. The general's accounts were empty. The vast paint empire C.T. Reynolds, built over decades, was teetering. Stocks had fallen. Partners turned away. To pay the bills of lawyers, detectives, and experts, the family spent a sum equivalent in modern money to about $10 million. $10 million for their son not to burn on the electric chair. But the worst was that Roland himself could no longer return to his former life. The Knickerbocker Club? The doors closed forever. Former friends crossed to the other side of the street upon seeing him. High society salons? His name became synonymous with bad taste. He became the ghost of the Gilded Age, a living reminder of the sin everyone wanted to forget. Roland tried to start a new life. He fancied himself a writer. In prison, he wrote the book, The Room with the Little Door. The Room with the Little Door. Dark, pretentious reflections on death. He thought the public would accept him as a wronged intellectual. But the book flopped. People were interested in reading about a monster, not a philosophizing whiner. In 1913, Roland married for the second time. Margaret Connell, his new chosen one, apparently hoped to save the wounded soul. But there was nothing to save. The rot we spoke of earlier now shifted from the metaphysical plane to the physiological. Syphilis. Tertiary syphilis, or progressive paralysis, the disease that at the time was shyly called softening of the brain, began its final assault. Roland had always been eccentric, but now he was becoming mad. He began delirious while awake. He imagined himself the greatest playwright in America. He wrote senseless plays and demanded they be staged on Broadway. The scene of the fall was pitiful. Once the most elegant man in New York, who wore suits from Savile Row, now wandered the streets in unkempt clothes, muttering curses under his breath. He caused scandals in restaurants that refused to serve him. He tried to break into producers' offices, waving manuscripts. In 1913, he had a nervous breakdown right on the street. He began running, screaming about demons and conspiracies. The police, the very same police that once hunted him as a genius of evil, now simply subdued him like an ordinary city lunatic. They did not take him to a private clinic in Switzerland. There was no money for that anymore. They took him to the State Psychiatric Hospital, Kings Park, on Long Island. There, where the poor and immigrants ended their days. General Edward Molyneux, the iron old man, could not withstand this final disgrace. He died in 1915, watching as the work of his entire life, both business and family, turned to dust. Obituaries wrote of his military exploits, but everyone knew it was not old age that killed him, but grief. Roland was left alone. In a ward with bars on the windows, he continued to live in his imaginary reality. He told the orderlies that a carriage would soon come for him to take him to the premiere. He demanded champagne, but he was given only water and sedatives. The liquidation was total. Not only paintings and antiquities from the Molyneux house went under the hammer, their very memory went under the hammer. The general's great art collection was sold for a pittance to cover debts. The surname that should have been associated with America's industrial might became merely a footnote in the crime chronicles. By 1917, nothing remained of the empire. No millions, no mansions, no reputation. Only a 51-year-old man with the mind of a child, strapped to a hospital bed, who in rare moments of lucidity might have remembered that day when he held the Tiffany silver bottle holder in his hands and thought he held the entire world. The mathematics of the curse balanced the accounts to zero. Roland Molyneux bought his life from the electric chair, but the price was his sanity and soul. The deal was complete. All that remained was to place the final period. November 2nd, 1917. Roland Molyneux's body was carried out of the psychiatric asylum through the back door. No crowds of journalists, no magnesium flashes, no weeping ladies in veils. The death of the man who had once been the most talked about person in America passed almost unnoticed. The newspapers that day wrote about something else. World War I raged in Europe, and in Russia, the Bolsheviks were preparing to storm the Winter Palace. The world had changed, and there was no longer room in it for Victorian-era gentlemen poisoners. Roland was buried in the family vault in Connecticut, next to his father, the general, who gave everything to save his son from the disgrace of execution, but could not save him from oblivion. Today, if you visit this cemetery, you will see modest headstones. No mausoleums, no marble angels. History seemed to try to erase this surname with an eraser. The C.T. Reynolds paint empire, which once colored all of America, long ago absorbed by corporations, resold, and dissolved into faceless holdings. The mansions demolished, soulless glass and concrete office boxes in their place. It would seem this is the end. Complete disappearance. But here lies the main irony of our tale. Roland Molyneux, who dreamed of fame as a writer and the greatness of an aristocrat, did achieve immortality after all. But not in bronze, and not in literature. He became the ghost that lives in every criminal case file across the United States. His true monument became the Molyneux Rule. Fast forward to the year 2025. A courtroom in Manhattan or Los Angeles. A high-profile trial is underway. On the defendant's bench, a Hollywood producer, a famous rapper, or a politician, the prosecutor stands up and tries to tell the jury about the defendant's dark past, his previous sins, to show a pattern of behavior. And immediately, the lawyer in a $5,000 suit jumps up and shouts, "Objection! This violates the Molyneux Rule." The judge nods and forbids the jury from hearing this information. You have heard this in the news hundreds of times. The Bill Cosby case, the Harvey Weinstein case, the Robert Durst case. Every time the defense blocks testimony about past crimes, it is the bony hand of Roland Molyneux reaching from the grave to shut the prosecutor's mouth. The millions of dollars spent by General Molyneux in 1901 bought not just freedom for his son. They bought a legal precedent that 120 years later continues to protect, and sometimes save from prison, the most heinous criminals of modernity. Think about this paradox. General Edward Molyneux was a war hero, an honest businessman, a patriot, but his name is forgotten. No one remembers his battles, and his son, a sociopath and murderer, became the foundation of American jurisprudence. This is that very price of wealth we spoke about at the beginning. Money can distort reality so strongly that the echo of this distortion will resound for centuries. And what about the victims? Mrs. Catherine Adams, a woman who simply wanted to get rid of a headache? Henry Barnett, guilty only of falling in love with the wrong woman? They are forgotten. Their names are known only to legal historians and fans of Victorian detective stories. The silver bottle holder from Tiffany, which became an instrument of murder, was probably melted down or gathering dust in the reserves of a police museum, having lost its deadly shine. The story of Roland Molyneux is a perfect mirror of the Gilded Age. On the outside, shine, ambitions, faith in endless progress and the power of capital. Inside, poison, madness, and emptiness. We look at old photographs of that era. Ladies in corsets, gentlemen in top hats, balls in Fifth Avenue mansions. It seems to us that it was a beautiful, romantic world. But the script of Roland's life tears off this mask. Beneath the gentleman's mask lurked a beast. Beneath the mask of justice lurked the power of money. Beneath the mask of love lurked cold calculation. Today, when you receive a package from a courier, be it a gift from a friend or an order from an online store, you do not think that inside there might be death. We live in a safer world, or so it seems to us. But human nature has not changed. Envy, vanity, the desire to possess what does not belong to you. These passions that guided Roland's hand when he mixed cyanide with medicine have not disappeared anywhere. They simply changed the scenery. Instead of gentlemen's clubs, closed chats and boards of directors, instead of poison in a bottle, digital harassment or financial destruction. Roland Molyneux died in an insane asylum, convinced that he was a great, unrecognized genius. Perhaps, in some perverted sense, he was right. He truly wrote a play that has been running on the stage of life for over a century. A play about how money can buy life, but kill the soul. And as long as the phrase Molyneux precedent is uttered in courts, this spectacle continues.